My name is Barbara Kolm. I direct the Austrian Economics Center in Vienna, and I would like to welcome everybody to our final event of the Free Market Roadshow Tour 2020, which is held in Iași, Romania. And we are partnering with the university there and the Hayek Institute. This year's main topic has been disruptive innovation. When our dear partners and colleagues from across Europe and we gathered in Vienna last January or January 2020, when we decided that this was the topic of the year, nobody knew what would be ahead, what kind of disruption we would see after March and the following months, whether it was due to a health crisis, a health issue, or the corona came. We had a lockdown crisis, and the economic consequences of that we are still fighting, or actually the next generations will have to fight. So today's last event of the Free Market Roadshow is actually, are demand policies a sufficient solution to the crisis? And with me, I have Professor Leszek Balcerowicz and Professor Bylund. Professor Balcerowicz is a well-known economist from Poland. He is a professor at the Warsaw School of Economics. He was the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in Poland in the transition period, and he was also president of the central bank in Poland. We have learned a lot from Professor Balcerowicz, not only during those past years at the Roadshow, when he was partnering with us and with his institute in Warsaw, and he was speaking, but also of what he and the so-called Balcerowicz plan did in the times of transition for Poland. And I'm very grateful to Leszek, and without further ado, I would like to give you the floor, because everybody knows you in our audience, and if not, they can all see the extensive list of publications and books that you have published and your CV on our website. Leszek, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for inviting me. What I'm going to say is based on a book in progress dedicated to the status bias in mainstream Western economics. It's enormous bias. Now, it is also only a fragment of that. First, let me start with the basic distinction between the supply side and the demand side of every economy. Now, as you know, the demand side very much depends on the institutional system. Compare South and North Korea. And it is the supply side which drives the productive power of the society. And this productive power of the society determines the purchasing power. As we know, Keynes has ridiculed the Say's law. But in the longer run, Say, who said that there's a certain balance between these two, was absolutely right. Now, I think it is a deviation in Western economics, especially recently, to focus so much on demand policies, meaning monetary, expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. They cannot compensate for bad supply side. Otherwise, North Korea would be as rich as South Korea. And many of these demand side policies are destructive. And I'm going to discuss what I consider to be destructive demand-side policies. And they are recently more popular, and they come in two versions. The one is radical, and the other is extreme. Now, the extreme version says, and I'm going to discuss it at the end, that it is the expansionary monetary fiscal policy which drives economic growth, not only in the short run, but also in the longer run. The moderate or still radical version has started some 10 years ago, just after the great financial crisis. And it is not as extreme as extreme version, but it usually refers to special situations which, according to its view, justify special measures. That's very popular. But there are at least two objections. How do you define special situations, and when do they end? For example, this is the story of unconventional monetary policy. And second, even if you are, it is obvious that there is a special situation like nowadays, the basic question is not special measures, but how much and what shape, what structure. We can refer to medicine. If a doctor said the maximum, the dose does not measure, the dose of the medicine does not count, he would end in prison because he would poison the patient. But this is just the rationale of aggressive demand policies nowadays prevailing in the West. Let me now switch to unconventional monetary policy. There's a huge literature. I will point to some issues only. First, it was understandable that just after the eruption of the crisis 2008, 2009, there was liquidity injections and special measures, and this is not the main point. The main point is that this policy has continued up to date until the recent crisis, even though it did not have much justification. And the justification which was put forward, I think is very dubious, has been very dubious, and I am coming to that. I think the continued justification for OMP was based on the side effects of unconventional monetary policy, which created the preconditions for continuity. So it was a vicious circle. And there are two components of this vicious circle. First, the central bankers have usually referred to the Wixelian natural rate of interest. And they assume that natural rate of interest has declined. And as a result, they said they have to reduce their interest and market interest, etc., etc. The problem was that this is a theoretical construct, and it has many different empirical approximations. And the approximations which were available, I think, did not justify sufficiently strongly to lower the interest rates by the central bank to zero. But once they lowered the interest rate to zero, they said we don't have any ammunition, so they have to revert to another measure, which was aggressive creation of central bank money, which is quantitative easing. And second point, I think even more important is that one can show to some extent that the probable decline in natural rate of interest was due to the side effect of central bank's policies, which is zombification of the economy. And if the governments are supplied with cheap money, they usually postpone the necessary supply side reforms. Central banks do not acknowledge that until recently. The second justification, which is also dubious, is the following one. They've been saying inflation is below our target. So we have to intensify and continue unconventional monetary policy without explaining why inflation is below the target. Now, first, when they say inflation, they only mean CPI. They disregard the prices of fiscal assets which have been driven by their policies. But even with respect to CPI, there's a question why. With this nominally aggressive monetary policy, inflation measured by CPI is so low. And to my surprise, most of the economists have disregarded the very slow rate of growth of money supply. Not only central bank, but the broader money supply. As you know, broader money supply consists for more than 90% of the money created by the commercial banks. And the rate of growth of money supply, such defined, has slowed down very much during this OMP in all countries, US, Eurozone, and Japan. Now, there is a separate question, why? Why? inflation has been, why the growth of money supply has been so low during OMP, and I don't have to go into this problem. I have in a separate paper, I have put forward certain hypotheses. One of them would be that overall demand for credit has been lowered, but probably more important is that the OMP has created extra barriers to the creation of money by the banks. But this is in my mind not settled. The point is that unconventional monetary policy has contributed to some extent to a slow growth of money supply, and in this way to low inflation. So this has been a self-justification besides this neutral Wixerian rate of interest. And let me come to the last point, which is extreme demand side policies. So we are moving from aggressive to extreme. What are the recent proposals? Recent proposals are helicopter money. Recent proposals even more aggressive creation by the central banks of money supply, so that governments can finance much more public investment. And public investment allegedly would drive both supply side and the demand side of the economy. So this would be a win-win strategy. This is very fashionable, including in the IMF to some extent. They are saying, well, you should be careful, but they are promoting it. What is this problem with this extreme policies, which relies, I repeat, on the assumption that very low interest rates would continue, and it should be used, and they should be used to expand public investment, and in this way to drive both demand side and supply side. This is completely utopian. It's completely unrealistic. They idealize the governments. It's like Keynes, but I would call it Keynes squared. They suppose there are angels over there which would put the money to the best use possible. Why we know this is not true? The whole history, public choice, etc., warns us against the expansion of the activity of the governments, and there's a lot of data which shows that much of public government is public investment is politicized. It's wasted in this way. So I would say this is a utopia. One cannot drive longer-term economic growth, but expanding, but hoping that interest rate will remain to be low, and by using it for the expanding public supply. And what is very interesting too, they are silent on the supply on the private sector, as though private sector did not exist, and as though the economy consisted only of the demand side. So this is the modern utopia. So what I could say at the beginning, we are approaching, I think this is to some extent a logical consequence of unconventional monetary policy. This is not something which originated all of a sudden. Central bankers continued this policy, which was not based on any credible theory. It was based on some quotations from some pseudo-classics. And once it turned out that there's another problem, there are people who now propose to go even further. But going either further, I think, is going to nowhere, in a very, very dangerous territory, because I think if this policy is continued, I am not speaking only about next year, I'm speaking about the longer future, then economic growth would be even lower. And I think that the threat of financial crisis due to inflated prices of assets, all these crazy things which are happening in the financial sector, which is disconnected for the real sector, could culminate in a crisis. And besides, The danger to these policies exists with respect to developed economies, but even more with respect to less developed economies, which would emulate the policies of the developed ones. So summing up, I think we are dealing with dangerous ultra-statist proposals. And what can we do? We should and could unmask them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Balcerowicz. You have always been very straightforward in unmasking policies that were not in favor of.
This is the only one. This is our duty.
Exactly. Of the individual when it comes to individual and entrepreneurial freedom. And entrepreneurial freedom is my next, actually our next guest will speak, is a professor of entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University, Professor Bylund. For him, it's 8:45 in the morning. Oh. Welcome, thank you that you join us on a Saturday. Without further ado, I will give you the floor, but briefly announce, of course, and make announce the journals that you are the associate editor of, the Journal of Enterprise and Public Policy and the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. And of course, you're also a fellow at the Mises Institute. So without further ado, the floor is yours. And after that, I would like to pose some questions to Professor Balcerowicz and then to you before I open the floor. Thank you. Per.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me see if I can share my screen here then. I think you can see this, right? Okay, so Professor Balcerowicz started out by talking about the production side and how supply side really drives the economy. It's not really the demand side, and that's probably the big error made in modern economics, especially macroeconomics. And what I want to do is basically prove that he is right and show the logic behind that reasoning, show that it is truly the production side, and it can only be the production side that drives the economy. It cannot be the demand side. And I want to do that by focusing on my specialization, my specialty, which is entrepreneurship. I mean, I'm an economist, but I do entrepreneurship. So I will go to the very low level in this and talk about the logic behind production and how that proves that the supply side is what is driving the economy. Okay, so if we start from the very beginning, the problem that we have is that we want a lot of stuff. We can always imagine ways that we are better off. We can always think of things that we don't like a whole lot, or situations that could be improved, that we are not perfectly at ease at any point, which means that we act in order to become better off. We all act in order to create value for ourselves, which simply means the removing of uneasiness. So value to begin with is subjective. It's something that is for me. It's how I improve my own life. It's using goods and services very often, especially in a market economy, but it's still something that it's my own personal appreciation. And the way I get value is through consumption. It's not necessarily by using a thing. It's not necessarily by eating something, but consumption broadly held, meaning that it's simply the use of something that helps me and make my day easier, more comfortable, warmer, cooler, whatever it is that I'm trying to achieve. And the way we get there in order to consume something is that we first produce it. Obviously, production precedes consumption, which is a point that apparently modern economists tend to they don't really realize this. So the economic problem then is that since we have all these wants, all these things that people want to do, all these ways that we can improve our lives, but we have so few resources and we have so little access to ways of improving our lives, that is the economic problem. How do we get more value for people out of what all these inputs that we have, or even better, how do we get more value out of these inputs from even less, from these outputs with even less input, which is basically economic growth. That is the problem that we're trying to solve in the economy. Okay, so this is from Carl Menger's Principles in 1871. and it still holds true. So production then is what we undertake in order to consume in the future. And it's wrong to think of the economy as a production process or production system, an apparatus that already exists that we need to manage. And that's usually how policymakers and macroeconomists address the economy. They look at it and see what it is, and then they try to tweak it, and they try to changes in one way or the other and change the direction it's heading and so forth. But the problem is that the issue is not how are we using the production processes already there, but it is the determination of what should be produced at all, when should it be produced, and how should we produce it. Those are the real questions. Okay, so the entrepreneur enters here and tries to solve this problem of value by foreseeing how they can satisfy consumers in the future, and they try to position their production processes with respect to the value that they see that or that they imagine that consumers will appreciate in the future, and they try to do so at a cost that is lower than the price that they can charge for the product. Okay, oh, that's the wrong way. So the economy itself is really about value. It's about personal subjective value. So that is the starting point. So when I teach entrepreneurship, I teach them that they should always start with the consumer. And it's the consumer's complete subjective experience of what they're producing that is the value that they get from a product or service. So if you start with that, that gives you an upper bound to what you can charge for it. So in a sense, the price that can be charged for a product is a function of the value that the consumer gets from it. So the price needs to be much lower than the value that the consumer actually gets, or the consumer would simply not choose to buy it. So there's profit involved for the consumer. That's the only reason why a consumer would buy a product. Well, if the value of the product is really in the consumer's eyes, and the price is really a function of the value for the consumer, the entrepreneur determines neither. The entrepreneur's role is just to figure out how something is valuable and how valuable it is, and then figure out what is the cost of production. So at the bottom, you can see that value is higher than price, which is higher than cost. And that's the optimal way things can shake out. And that's what every entrepreneur is really aiming for, producing a lot of value offered at a price that is lower and produced at a cost that is even lower, meaning that there's profit for both the consumer and for the entrepreneur. Okay. The issue, of course, for the entrepreneur is that the consumer is always sovereign. So when the entrepreneur produces something, it doesn't matter what the consumer says beforehand, or what agreement you might have, or how many people you have asked, or if the consumer is involved in production or anything like that. What matters is when you have the product ready and you want to sell it, the consumer can always say no, and the consumer might not appreciate what you're actually offering. So at the end of the day, it's always the consumer who is sovereign and can will determine whether to buy the product and consume it, whether they think that it will be useful for them, if they imagine that they can use it in a way that makes their lives better off. So they choose whether to consume and when to consume. Do you want dinner now, or do you want dinner later in the day? Do you want to buy a car now, or do you prefer waiting until next year, or what have you? And they also determine how to consume. So the entrepreneur cannot even determine or decide for the consumer how to use a good. Very often the consumer discovers how to use something, and that is a surprise to the entrepreneur who produced it, which is fascinating, but it's also troublesome for the entrepreneur. And of course, the consumer decides to what end they will use the product that the entrepreneur produces. Okay, so that is, of course, is a huge problem for the entrepreneur, because the entrepreneur then needs to position their product and make sure that, first of all, well, that the product is of value to the consumer at all. Does it satisfy a want that the consumer has? That's the first thing that they need to make sure that that is the case. And then second, is it a good way for the consumer to satisfy that want that they have? In other words, is my product or service better at satisfying that want for the consumer than other products and services that satisfy the same want? Because if it's not, then I will not be able to sell to the consumer, because the consumer will buy another product. And then that is still not enough. So even if you are offering the product that will best satisfy a certain want for the consumer might still have other wants that are more valuable, that are more urgent to the consumer, so that they will instead choose to satisfy some other urge or want that they have, to remove some uneasiness that is different from the uneasiness that you can remove through the product that you're offering as an entrepreneur. Well, that too is not enough. So even if you're offering a good that is satisfying a want that the consumer has, satisfying it in a better way than any other product available, and it is a want that is held more highly of value by the consumer than any other want, it's still not enough. Because if the consumer expects to be able to get more value if they wait and consume later on, they will still not buy your product. So you will offer that high value to the consumer on the consumer's own terms, that you have to check all of these boxes. It has to appear for the consumer to be the best possible use for their money in the present. And that's, of course, a very hard problem to solve. This is one way of illustrating the problem involved here, because how do you satisfy a want that a consumer has by production? Because you produce now for a want that they will have in the future, a want that they might not know about, a want that you certainly do not know about. You can produce something that has been produced before, but very often what entrepreneurs do is imagine a new way of doing it, producing a new type of good. So the iPhone was a new innovation, a new way of thinking about communication that is completely different from the flip phones that were available beforehand. Now, had you asked someone, all the consumers, what they wanted in the next generation of the flip phone, what is the next generation of cell phone that you want, they would have said even smaller, because that's how they competed back then, and you wanted a smaller and smaller and smaller flip phone. Well, the iPhone was a much bigger phone. It's completely different, but it included other features that most consumers were not aware of were possible, and they couldn't imagine. And in this quote on this slide, you have Henry Ford, who supposedly said, well, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, because people were using horses and not automobiles. So that's how we think. We think about what we have, and then we just think like a little better version of what we have. But a good entrepreneur does not do that. A good entrepreneur imagines how to better satisfy consumers on the consumer's own terms. And Henry Ford did that through offering the Model T, a Ford automobile, right? So, and he did that in a way that consumers really appreciated. They appreciated more than the horses that they had, and more than faster horses that they might have been able to imagine. Okay, so the entrepreneur needs to imagine new ways that work on the consumer's own terms. So what the entrepreneurs do then is they imagine a situation for the consumer where the consumer is much better off by using the product or service offered on the consumer's own terms, considering the situation that they will be in the future. Now, this is, of course, super difficult, and it includes a lot of, well, magic, you could call it, if thinking about how you can make people's lives better off, how you can improve their everyday lives, how you can make sure that they are more comfortable, that they get better service, they get higher quality, they get more leisure time, they don't have to work as much, and things like that. And they do this, the entrepreneurs do this by investing in production before they know if the consumer at all values the product. So you have to start production of this good that no one has seen before, that no one can know the value of, way before you can even attempt to sell it. Okay, so that is by production must precede consumption. And for any entrepreneur, it definitely does, always. And that's the problem with the demand side policies, that what they're doing is it's stimulating demand, stimulating basically the purchasing of products. The issue is that you're purchasing products that have already been produced. And that production has already been put in place. So entrepreneurs have already imagined ways that they will satisfy consumers in the future. They've already made investments. They've already started production. And then you're stimulating demand for the products that already exist. But the economy, in order for the economy to improve and proceed, entrepreneurs need to invest in production of new types of goods and services that satisfy consumers a whole lot better in the future. That's also how we get jobs and earn the purchasing power to buy goods. But unless we look at the production side and the supply side, we cannot get to value in the demand side. So basically what I'm saying is that considering the entrepreneurial aspect of this, and entrepreneurs are in the business of creating our tomorrow. They don't create our today, they create our tomorrow. That's what they're working on now, is how we will satisfy our wants in the future. And what demand side policies are focused on is not seeing the sort of this temporal sequence that production precedes consumption. They focus only on consumption and getting people to buy more now, which of course means that entrepreneurs already in business will ramp up production, but it doesn't tell us anything at all about which projects should entrepreneurs undertake now to satisfy us better in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Per. Could you turn back the screen, please, so that we can see? Thank you very much. So I would like to directly open the floor and ask Professor Leszek Balcerowicz. I have a couple of questions here for him. And just summing up, I think this was a wonderful compliment to complementing Professor Balcerowicz's talk. And we see the issues of micro and macro and in practice. And Professor Balcerowicz, having been an active politician, I think can explain for us the issue that we see these days, the decoupling, the isolation of theory and practice, and the issue that the individual, who in the end is actually the voter for the politician, is completely left out, especially in the processes that Leszek, that you described, whether it's the extreme version or just the moderate radical version. So the first question for Leszek is by Christian Paun, professor of economics from Iasi in Bucharest. He asks, what did Romania lack, or what did Poland have in addition to succeed in imposing a rapid transition? And he would also like to hear your political, from the political perspective, from the political standpoint as well, Leszek.
Well, it goes beyond my topic.
Well, I know that you are perfectly, you can address that.
But there are also chance factors. The chance factor in Poland was that, let's say I had a hobby in the late 70s. I have not dreamt that Poland would be free, but I was interested in problems, deeper problems of economic growth. I have no illusion about socialism, and I have created a group of informal people, then young as myself, to work on fundamental problems for fun. We are not prophets, but when unexpectedly Poland became free, we were the only team who had at least a strategy. So this is why I was invited, and so on. And this first phase of radical reforms is important because it gives a certain direction. And this is why in Poland, the next government, even though they were not as radical as we were in the first 2 years, did not reverse. But a warning, the last 5 years in Poland, it is a reversal. So you have to be very careful, and you have to try to teach the public about something which has worked but had been undermined, meaning competition, private ownership, rule of law, etc., etc. So this would be my response. There's certainly no magic formula, but work, fight the populists and fight the authoritarians. And sometimes you win. Without fighting them, you always lose.
There comes another question by Radu Nechita. He's professor of economics at UBB University, and this is probably an add-on to what you already mentioned. He asks, Poland is usually associated with shock therapy, another term coined by the enemies of freedom. And he asks what measures or what reforms you think were put into practice were too fast, that you took action. Would moderate access have been easier or better for people to understand? Or what advice, if you look back?
I don't find any reform which were too fast, even in Poland. Most of them were too slow, not too fast. Certainly privatization. And there's an illusion that if you're slow and you educate, then people would accept. That's completely untrue, because if you are slow at the beginning, you use a precious time. I call it the time of extraordinary politics, when people are more ready than normal to accept measures which are regarded sometimes as harsh. If you are slow, that opponents of reform would mobilize, and you stop it in the early phases. And this is the experience of slow reformers. They mobilize because you may live very well from the bad system. So opponents of the better system, before it is created, are solidifying their position in a bad system. And then it's more difficult to reform.
Thank you. If we come to today's politics, and especially after the so-called COVID crisis, but which actually turned into a lockdown crisis for our economies. We see the so-called frugal four countries. One of them is Austria, that actually stuck to their budget and tries to keep in their, the spending low, but obviously on the European level, spending is big. What is your take on the measures taken currently, both by the EU, and also the ECB, if I may ask?
Well, on ECB previous policies, I already have said, when they were following the Fed, perhaps they were forced to follow the Fed, because one Fed lowers the interest rates. If ECB did not do that, there would be appreciation of the euro, which would be very harmful. So the main culprit is Fed. And I think the monetary policy in the US is deeply wrong, but it's very popular in academic circles. But deeply wrong, deeply. Even if it is not so harmful to the US, it's very harmful to the outside world, and they are dictating monetary policy in the world. Okay, so this is, you were asking me about now it was unavoidable that with deep decline in spending, there would have to be some, and I am not condemning it, I'm not criticizing it. The question is how much? How much and for how long? Now, it is one time. So, I think it is reasonable to assume that next year, with vaccines, gradually the epidemics would be over. So it will be increased debt, but this is one time. What is much worse, what happened in Poland, when the present government has sharply increased social spending, which is lasting. And most of our fiscal problems are not due so much to this extra spending to cope with the consequences of pandemics, but with increased social spending. And the worst is lowering the retirement age. We have a rapid aging population, so it costs us $24 billion a year extra spending, pension spending. So I would my advice, look at the current spending, which could be lasting. So if you are frugal in Austria on that, that's very good. So worry much more about lasting spending than about this extra spending.
But even if this extra spending is that we see these days by Brussels and then by the Commission is a kind of one time, if we look back in the last crisis, the so-called financial crisis, 2007, 2008, 2009, when we saw what has the outcomes and what has happened, starting with the European Stability Mechanism, etc. If we look at the numbers and figures, the spending back then, bailouts and other support, was much, much, much lower than what we see these days. How can we, and we still have not recovered from the last crisis. So how can we proceed if we constantly build up debt in the long run? Somebody will have to pay the price.
With this present policies, in the long run or medium run, we are all dead.
Okay, thank you.
Case.
Yes. Okay, it's in a different way. This brings me to my last, actually to another question that I have from the floor by Christian Enashe, and he's a friend of the Hayek Institute in Romania. And he writes, realistically, can the gold standard still be restored as the basis of a healthy economy? Can we talk about a political will necessary in this regard?
Well, on that, I would refer you to my good friend, George Selgin. Remember, he's the best one on the monetary regimes. And he acknowledges the virtues of the gold standard, but at the same time, he's doubtful whether it can be restored. Why? Because so much has happened afterwards and so much vested interest that perhaps it's very difficult to make a transition. I wish it was not true, but read Sergin, Cato Institute, the best monetary economist I know. Okay?
Wonderful.
Can I add something there?
Yes, before, yes, please do.
So I would agree, you read George Selgin, but I think for where we are at right now in terms of monetary policy, most modern currencies are so destroyed and so based on central bank policy that you can't really reform it back to a gold standard. But I think what we are seeing and what we probably will see is new currencies emerging from below, where people adopt other currencies to either just stay away from taxation, that's one thing, but also to have currencies that they trust for whatever reason. We have Bitcoin and other cryptos, of course, but I think people will also start using private money based in
coins, whatever.
So
yeah, they can be based on anything, right? Gold or silver or what have you, or they could be. We have plenty of projects where people are producing coins and bills that are backed to 100% in something valuable, that I think people will start using that, especially as inflation hits.
That's very interesting. I am following it with sympathy, and if this go on, then Hayek would be vindicated with his proposal to privatize the money.
Indeed.
Exactly. I have Professor Ishvan here on the floor, and he asks two questions to Leszek, and he says, if I may read, because obviously the Wi-Fi doesn't work well for him. So the first question is related to the topic delivered today, and that is, besides the effectiveness of efficiency of demand side policies, could it be some problems with the theory which underlies this Keynesian demand side management?
Well, it's totally wrong. Well, you know, this is absolute. I am just writing this book and I am rereading Keynes and other. It's unbelievable amount of fallacies. Let me show you this book. This is written by Henry Hazlitt. He was not an academic economist, but he was a great economist. And this is the best unmasking of Keynes fallacies. So I think, I think this mainstream economics, especially in the US, especially the macroeconomic in the US, has been driving better economics. And since economic issues are so much discussed in politics, there are strong incentives for some economists to offer easy solutions. Incentives work with respect to economists too, to some economists. And say, if astronomy was so much discussed in the public, who would be more acknowledged, Copernicus or Ptolemaeus? Ptolemaeus. So case is more acknowledged nowadays than Mrs. But this is not because of the academic virtues, because of this demand for fallacies, for easy fallacies. So we have to fight even harder.
And now we have modern
the
monetary theory too.
Yeah.
Oh,
which is even worse.
This is the culmination. This is
Yeah.
not new. This is old. This is,
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's just a little worse.
Of course, because it's called modern.
I have one more question for you, and then we have a couple of others for both of you. So the second question that was by Professor Ishan is what supposing that we will pass in good health and wealth through this pandemic, would you have the availability to do a visit at the University of Iasi in the next future?
Public commitment.
That's
Thank you very much, Professor, for this very kind invitation. I will seriously consider it.
Wonderful. So now these are the questions, I think, for both of you, since we are discussing macro and monetary policy, including including entrepreneurship questions. So Stefan Konstantin from Facebook asks, what is your opinion on governmental bailouts? Do you think that the government should do that, or business that can sustain themselves? In a time of crisis should not exist, or should they be allowed to fail? So I think what Konstantin is referring to is probably also Schumpeter, that firms that are not innovative and not productive any longer should go bust, or should they be bailed out? So this is a twofold question, one with regards to government and one with regards to the firm. I'll give the floor to both of you. Who wants to start?
Perhaps I would start.
Please do. Leszek.
Sure, absolutely.
You'll start.
Sure, I'll do that. Well, I would say the easy answer is to yes, let them fail. And part of the problem is that bailouts, just like Leszek mentioned, there are incentives in bailouts too, and there's cronyism. So they're not actually going to bail out the ones that would be best for the economy to bail out. And also they need to be bailed out only because they have positioned themselves wrong. So they have taken on too much debt, or they have invested in the wrong things. And what the economy overall needs is that the resources that they have are released so that entrepreneurs can use them for something else. Because obviously consumers are not demanding what they produced. So the resources need to be released for entrepreneurs to try other things. The problem here, of course, is that we have too high barriers to entry for entrepreneurs to actually use the resources in the ways they want to. So there's a lot of frictions caused by policy. So we need to remove that policy too, to allow entrepreneurs to make these investments necessary. But definitely do not bail them out and let others use those resources in better ways.
Okay. May I add that bailout, another name for bailout is soft budget constraint, expression coined by Cornell. So if firms enjoy a soft budget constraint, there is no competition, because if competition requires also negative incentives and, as Per said, movement of resources from firm, creative destruction.
Wonderful, thank you. I've got another question for Per. Per, do you think that in the future we will use Bitcoin as a daily currency?
Well, I think a lot of people already are, but will we? That question is a little tricky, I think, because will it be Bitcoin specifically? I don't know. But will there be some other currency, some private currency? Yes, I think so. But I can't say if it will be crypto to begin with, because Bitcoin is not actually backed with anything. Or will it be a crypto version backed in gold? Or will it be a simple gold currency? It depends on how society changes in the next few years and the next couple of decades. But definitely, I think we will see a lot of people, like I mentioned before, turning to using other, probably not central bank-based currencies.
Well, in that case, I have a question for both of you. The Swedish central bank is experimenting already with cryptocurrencies. The European Central Bank is discussing it, and other central banks do so too. So what is your take, event given, or in the future, let's say money will not be printed, but it will be based on a stable coin or whatever other system we do not know yet. But what will be the consequences if we don't have physical cash in our hands? Or do you
we're basically there already, right? I mean, most of the money we use are either credit cards or their bank accounts. So they're ones and zeros, they're bits and bytes. So most of what we use are not cash anyway. The real consequence, I think, of introducing a cryptocurrency by central banks is to make people used to using cryptocurrencies so that they can choose something else that actually has value.
The term is value.
Yeah, but I'm a bit worried about central banks dealing with cryptocurrencies, because they would not be private currencies then. Second, I would like to be for a system where not all financial transactions are known to the authorities, because they would control everything. Even decent citizens would be controlled.
This is where my question was heading to. I have another one for you, both of you. Doesn't the US dollar represent a monopoly because the IMF only accepts dollars and all international trade is made in dollar? Will it help having two currencies like the euro?
Well, I think the US monetary policy has long been based on the fact that others are using the dollar so that they can print a lot of money, and those newly printed dollars go abroad. So they do not affect prices at home. And you could argue that the wars fought in the Middle East are in response to their using different currencies. So when oil countries are talking about using the euro or some other currency to trade in oil, well, then there is usually another war coming. So, I mean, in a sense, it is a monopoly situation. I think the Fed, like Leszek mentioned before, is the real culprit, and they can be the real culprit because the dollar is the only hard currency.
Well, you more or less summarized at least part of the questions that were posed by Dumitra and by Elena, and they both asked, and maybe Leszek, you want to add on, will other new currencies or cryptocurrencies appear that will outperform the dollar or the euro? And the second was, what do you think the impact of the digital euro will have in countries in the EU that didn't adopt the euro? And that's interesting.
I don't know, frankly speaking, so are better experts, but let me say, add to what Per said. I agree. Dollar, for some reason, is enjoying huge network effects. So why you have then, this is not a formal, this is informal, quasi-monopolistic position. I would hope that that would be a competitor to a dollar, because then the macroeconomic policy of the US would not be as bad as it is. And this would be very good for the rest of the world.
I have got a good question before we move to the last set and leave the currency issue. What is the difference between cryptocurrencies and tulips of old?
Harder backing.
Okay, so let's move a little bit to entrepreneurship. And since Leszek was also promoting entrepreneurship, has always promoted entrepreneurship. I would ask both of you to answer those questions. If an entrepreneur thinks about how to please the consumer, there is also the possibility that the product he created will not increase demand. What can we do to satisfy the consumer so that demand increases?
Consumers are behind the demand.
I'm not sure I understand the question even, because the demand is the result of creating something valuable. So we don't have to create demand. There's never a problem with demand. Demand is never deficient because it is what consumers think it's worth their money to buy. And if there's nothing, then they shouldn't buy. It's really a disaster for the economy if the government steps in to stimulate demand and make sure that people buy stuff that they otherwise wouldn't buy. Why would they? That's just a waste of funds. And it's a waste of resources.
And by that, you actually have already answered Claudia's question, who asks, what is more important in the economy, demand or supply? And
yeah, supply, for sure.
Exactly. And then, and then maybe Leszek, you could also give a short remark on the good old supply side economists, Richard Rahn and all our friends who back then in the Reagan era made a lot of change, brought a lot of changes. Maybe you would like to say something because we have a young audience who probably is not familiar with that.
Well, one can distinguish between a fundamental supply policy and narrow supply policy. With respect to Reagan, it was very important that he tried to improve basically good system, which was capitalism. But a fundamental supply policy is to move from a very destructive regime, which is socialism, anti-capitalism, to a free market economy. So the most important and comprehensive and radical supply side policy was started in Central and Eastern Europe after the downfall of communism, because they dealt with not only with taxes, property rights are fundamental. Moving from a politically dominated state ownership economy to a private economy. Second, competition. So removal of many restrictions. And third, rule of law. So that people would not be so much afraid of their rights. So these were the fundamental supply side reforms. And any reform, serious reform, is a supply side reform. And then demand follows.
Thank you, Leszek. Per, last question to you. Can a business be profitable if a product has an unlimited life duration?
Sure. Of course you can. I mean, if there's only one customer, then the customer will be willing to pay a lot for that good if it can be of utility for the customer forever. But there are also many customers. And I think we should, imagine if the first iPhone would never break and the first iPhone would always work. It doesn't mean that we don't want something new and something fancy and something different. Right, so we would still want, maybe not iPhone 2, but iPhone 35. So we would still want something different, and the consumer is not satisfied by simply satisfying a want, but it's also how it's satisfied. So we're choosing between different goods, and we're choosing an upgrade because that gives us a little more satisfaction in some other way, and that's how we choose between products. So we can absolutely be profitable for a long time, even with goods that never that are eternal.
Well, thank you. So last sentence by both of you, 30 seconds. What would be your favorite topic for next year's Free Market Roadshow? This year we had disruptive innovation. How should we what should we do next year?
How to beat the populists.
Excellent. Thank you. Kea, what is yours?
Well, I think that's a good one, and that's part of how to save the world, which would be my favorite topic.
Wonderful. So I think we will have a wonderful combination of both those topics. This was the last event of this year's Free Market Roadshow. I thank very much, I give my thanks to our audience, to all those many people who are listening, who joined us, and also who posted questions on the chat. I have to apologize, we could not answer not even 1/3 of them. There's still lots of them going on. So we see there is demand of our Free Market Roadshow and of our events. Thank you, Leszek. Thank you, Per, for joining us and for taking your time on this Saturday. We look forward to welcoming you all next year at the Free Market Roadshow, hopefully live again. In all those 40 countries in Europe that we tour and where we have our partners, whether it's universities or think tanks or institutes that join, please visit our website, www.freemarket-rs.com. And also one last announcement, there is one final event next week on the 17th of December at 6 p.m. It's on economics of Christmas. It's with our partner in Italy, with Pietro Paganini and the Compensate Institute. It will be an Austrian economics event, 17th of December. We wish you a wonderful Saturday and Sunday, and may you all stay healthy and bear with all those consequences that we now have discussed, and that everybody stays well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you.
May I add a few words?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, thank you very much. We wish to thank you very much for your kindness and your efforts and representing a high institute from Romania. Let me to say a few words to those great professors, to those two great professors, Professor Balcerowicz and Professor Bylund. At least some of their works are well known by our colleagues and even by some of our graduate students. Perhaps all we know about the transition process from the central planning to the free market economy, we've learned from this great book published by Professor Balcerowicz in 1995, Socialism, Capitalism, Transformation. This is a wonderful book. And of course, we've learned something from this, the failure of new economics, which is let's say, a refutation of a Keynesian demand side management. And of course, some of the papers written by Professor Bylund are well known. I mean, at least his new theory of the firm, based on the division of labor, and some of his papers published by Mises Institute from Auburn, Alabama, and by Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. And we wish, again, to thank them very much, and hopefully that they will have, let's say, some spare time in the future to visit our university when the moment or the event will be proper to them. This conference, or their conferences, reminded me by two great writers, an Austrian one, that is Musil, about the man without futures, and Czesław Miłosz, that is a Lithuanian-Polish writer, Captive Mind. And I hope that free market economics, either Austrian economics or classical British economics, is the best tool against these captive mind politics, which is made by, let's say, the cartel of international bureaucracy or national bureaucracy, because we are speaking a lot about the cartels of drugs from Colombia or Mexico, but
Martin, I think Vasile has dropped out again. I would like to thank everybody for joining us. Our session is over now, and looking forward to seeing you next year again live at our events. Per, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have had you, and thanks for the insights and the wonderful education you provided for our students. Bye-bye, take care, and good luck to everybody. Stay healthy.